Introduction to Disaster Risk Management. Disaster Risk Management. Concepts and Terminology. In this presentation, we introduce the basic concepts related to disaster management and the key elements of a comprehensive disaster management framework. The objective of this introductory presentation is to have a common understanding of principles, terms, and processes involved in disaster management, and, in a systemic way, provide a guide through the complexity of issues that development practitioners are facing when they deal with natural disasters. Disasters caused by natural hazards such as earthquakes, floods, landslides, drought, and tropical cyclones have a heavy toll on human lives, economic and social infrastructure, and on ecosystem. While natural hazards remain part of our existence, human actions can either increase or reduce the vulnerability of societies to hazards and related disasters. The pattern of development, specifically the persistence of widespread poverty, rapid and uncontrolled urbanization, and environmental degradation, have left many regions and countries more vulnerable to natural hazards. Many factors contribute to increased vulnerability. Rapid growth and increasing poverty in urban areas. Many countries have experienced rapid and uncontrolled urban expansion, characterized by inadequate land use and infrastructure development. Migration of the poor to urban areas and settling where land is cheap, mostly disaster-prone areas like steep hillsides and floodplains, put cities and its population to greater risk. Current land use regulations and controls are mostly unsuccessful to prevent the growing number of illegal settlements with poorly designed and low-quality constructions. Poverty and environmental degradation in rural areas. The large number of poor in rural areas has resulted in increased reliance on natural resources as a main source of rural subsistence. The marked deterioration of environment and natural resources, such as deforestation, riverbank alterations, and inappropriate hillside agriculture, contributes to diminishing natural protection against hazards. Poor policy planning. Few countries pursued public policies based on understanding of vulnerabilities and actions redressing them. Land use and building code regulations are inadequate and poorly enforced in most of the hazard-prone areas. Incentives to encourage economic factors to adopt preventive measures are mostly missing. Allocation of the necessary resources to infrastructure maintenance in order to sustain resistance to natural hazards is frequently overlooked. Last but not least, the emphasis on disaster response, that represented the main focus in the past, absorbed a great deal of resources which would normally be allocated for well-grounded development efforts. The natural alternative of the above approach is the promotion of framework that puts the emphasis on disaster risk reduction and on strengthening the capacity of societies to cope with natural hazards. Examples include soil erosion and loss of vegetative cover that diminishes the land's capacity to absorb heavy rainfall and thus contributes to landslides and flash floods. Mangrove forests that provide protection against high winds are disappearing from hurricane-prone coastal areas. In general terms, disasters are discrete events occurring at a specific point of time at a particular geographical area, affect a large population, and require external assistance to cope with consequences. In order to manage the risk from natural disasters, it is necessary to understand the threat posed by hazard, the magnitude of values, human lives and assets exposed to the threat, susceptibility towards hazards in the form of vulnerabilities and actions, and measures to protect human values. The specific terms that are used to describe disasters are natural hazards, vulnerability and risk. Vulnerability is a set of conditions resulting from physical, social, economic and environmental factors which increase susceptibility to losses from the impact of natural hazards. It is important to remember that incidence of natural events that could cause disasters lies beyond human control, while vulnerability can be controlled. Risk is the probability of harmful consequences or expected losses resulting from interactions between natural hazards and vulnerable conditions. Risk management is defined as the process of identifying, analyzing, and quantifying the probability of losses in order to undertake preventive or corrective actions. This involves two types of activities. 1. planning actions to reduce vulnerability in areas where risk can be controlled. And 2, establishing protective mechanisms against the potential economic losses from the uncontrollable factors of natural hazards. As we have discussed earlier, disasters result from the combination of hazards, conditions of vulnerabilities that usually accumulate over time, and insufficient capacity or measures to reduce the potential damages. Since little can be done to reduce the occurrence and intensity of most natural hazards, actions and activities should focus on reducing existing and future vulnerabilities to damage and loss. There are 3 primary and interrelated categories in risk management: risk identification, risk reduction, and risk transfer. These measures are mostly related to pre-disaster phases of disaster risk management and reflect the new approach that puts the emphasis on ex-ante actions instead of measures taken prior, as in preparedness, or during and shortly after a disaster event, as with disaster response, relief, recovery, and rehabilitation. Natural hazard risk management significantly differs from traditional preparedness and response activities. It takes a proactive and systemic approach by ensuring that growth and development policies incorporate vulnerability reduction measures and natural resource management considerations. In a graphical presentation, the risk reduction framework can be seen along a continuum of post-disaster and pre-disaster phases. Some argue that categorization according to disaster cycle is artificial, since restoring livelihood after a catastrophic event is already a mitigation activity from the perspective of the next disaster event. While acknowledging that different views and approaches exist, for the purposes of our course, we will follow the model described above. The pre-disaster phase of disaster risk management involves 4 distinct but interrelated components: risk identification, risk reduction mitigation, risk transfer, and preparedness. Risk identification and analysis is a thorough analysis of existing vulnerabilities, location, severity, and intensity of threat. Determining the causes of existing vulnerabilities makes it possible to eliminate or reduce them. The following activities help identify and understand the natural hazard risk. 1. Hazard data collection and mapping, including frequency, magnitude, and location. 2. Vulnerability assessment, where population and assets are exposed. And 3. Risk assessment, examining the probability of expected losses. Risk reduction or prevention mitigation are measures taken to eliminate or reduce the intensity of a hazardous event. They can address existing vulnerabilities through measures like retrofit or strengthening. Actions can be taken to reduce future vulnerabilities, such as implementation and enforcement of building standards, environmental protection measures, and resource management practices. To reduce risk, it is necessary to develop mitigation plans that determine who, what, when, and where regarding the implementation of preventive and corrective activities. These plans should include a detailed cost-benefit analysis to evaluate the long-term profitability of the prevention and mitigation measures. Risk transfer mechanisms do not reduce actual vulnerability. Transfer mechanisms reduce financial risk by ensuring that funds are available when loss occurs. Risk transfer mechanisms are often inefficient from a cost perspective, so it is important to take all the necessary measures to reduce the vulnerability of assets to be covered before transferring the risk. The 4th element of ex-ante phase planning is emergency preparedness. It aims at improving the capacity to respond rapidly and effectively to save lives, reduce suffering, and enhance recovery of communities after a disaster strikes. It includes early warning systems, evacuation plans, establishing shelters. Improving understanding and communication among actors involved and mobilizing response is critical for reducing potential impacts of disasters. Since preparedness is closely related to actions at the level of individuals and communities, coordination among them is critical. Risk reduction or prevention mitigation measures can be directed towards physical, social, and environmental vulnerability. It is very important that post-disaster reconstruction and rehabilitation incorporates mitigation elements instead of rebuilding earlier vulnerability. Physical measures are divided into structural and non-structural measures. Structural risk reduction measures include any actions that require the construction to reduce the effects of a hazard event, such as flood and windproofing, elevation, seismic retrofitting, and burial of utilities. Non-structural measures are policies and programs that guide future development and investment towards reduced hazard vulnerability. Examples of non-structural measures include physical development plans, development regulations, acquisition of hazardous properties, tax and fiscal incentives, and public education. Socio-economic measures aim at increasing the resilience of individuals and communities to hazard effects. Activities include raising awareness of hazards and vulnerabilities and helping to establish community and mutual assistance networks and programs. Activities that help build individual and community hazard resilience require a parallel strengthening of the capacity of the state to anticipate and respond to future extreme events, since failures at the national level can render many community initiatives ineffective. Environmental risk reduction measures are designed to protect existing or rehabilitate degraded environmental systems that have the capacity to reduce the impacts of natural hazards. These can take the form of policies and programs, such as development control or environmental impact assessments that reduce or eliminate the effect of human activities on the environment. They can also include physical measures that restore or fortify damaged environmental systems, such as coral reef protection, reforestation of critical watersheds, or restoration of degraded river courses. The main transfer risk financing methods are budget self-insurance, allocation of a small proportion of budget to be spent on improved maintenance. This action makes it possible to either forego the purchase of regular insurance or to achieve a higher deductible, thus lowering the insurance cost. Market insurance and reinsurance. Insurance provides coverage for damage and expenses that are beyond the potential for budget self-insurance. Once the extent of coverage has been agreed and premiums are paid under an insurance contract, the insurer assumes the risk and makes available the funds necessary to repair damage or rebuild shortly after a disaster event. Insurance costs for certain categories of buildings or uses, however, may be unaffordable, and coverage for some categories of natural hazards may be unavailable. Public asset coverage. Most public assets are not covered by insurance. Funds for rebuilding damaged assets, therefore, must come from annual budgets or external sources. This puts great pressure on public budgets. Insurance coverage for critical public assets will ensure that key infrastructure can be rebuilt or rehabilitated quickly if damaged in a hazard event. Selection of assets that merit insurance coverage should be based on careful prioritization of public facilities and on comprehensive facility vulnerability assessments. Risk pooling and diversification. Insurance costs for geographically concentrated or relatively homogeneous groups or facilities are often high due to the potential for simultaneous damage to all members of the group or category. Diversification of the risk pool through banding with others from separate areas or industries can result in reduced insurance premiums for all participants. Risk financing. Risk financing mechanisms allow losses to be paid off in the medium to long term via some form of a credit facility. Alternative risk financing mechanisms provide cost-effective, multi-year coverage that assists with the stabilization of premiums and increases the availability of funds for insurance purposes. Post-disaster phases include emergency response, rehabilitation and recovery, and reconstruction. After disaster strikes, humanitarian assistance takes over to save lives and provide essential supply to the most affected. This stage is relatively short and includes activities such as search and rescue, evacuation, provision of shelters, first aid, emergency medical care, temporary restoration of transport and communication. Rehabilitation refers to the stage when activities aim at restoring the normal conditions in the affected areas and communities. Temporary repairs of housing, buildings and infrastructure, such as transport and public utilities, are done during this period. It is very important to focus on measures that help victims to return to work, create new job opportunities, mobilize public, insurance and multilateral financial resources, and launch projects that deal with other consequences of disasters. Reconstruction phase includes activities that revitalize affected economic sectors, rebuild critical infrastructure, and allocate appropriate budgetary resources according to newly emerged social priorities. It is important to emphasize that reconstruction should incorporate mitigation measures to reduce vulnerabilities of future disasters. During the second stage of post-disaster damage assessment, activities should be carried out to identify the needs and priorities for the reconstruction phase. Implementation of effective disaster management systems requires political commitment, which manifests in appropriate policies, planning, supporting legislation, and resources devoted to disaster management issues. While the systems vary according to political and economic culture of the countries, there are some general requirements to be considered when designing the governance systems. Existence of a national preparedness plan and strategy is an indication of such a political commitment. Disaster planning should be proactive, with focus on preparedness and mitigation. Risk reduction should be mainstreamed in development, planning and sectoral policies. The strategy and planning should be supported by legislation, including laws, acts and regulations, with clear assignments of responsibilities and accountabilities. Financial, human and technical resources, including innovative and alternative funding, taxes and incentives, should be mobilized and allocated for risk reduction and management. From an organizational perspective, it is important to follow multidisciplinary and multisectoral approaches. In a formal system, there is a key interministerial agency, mandated with authority and resources to coordinate all related actors such as ministries, donor agencies, NGOs and private sector. The system must ensure a close working relationship between the policy formulating body and the operational agency that must implement the decisions. Links between national, regional, local and community level is crucial in ensuring vertical communication, information and resource flow. The model should fully integrate NGOs in order to improve the cooperation and establish a comprehensive, integrated pattern of response. The institutional aspect includes systemic development of necessary codes, standards, norms and enactment mechanisms. Several countries are in the process of integrating key elements of disaster risk management into their national disaster management systems. Governance indicators include existence of national risk reduction strategy, percentage of GDP allocated for disaster reduction, incorporation of disaster reduction in poverty reduction strategies, percentage of budget allocation for prevention and mitigation, existence of disaster reduction committees or platforms with defined responsibilities and activities, periodic review of committee activities and accomplishments, and systematic control of compliance and enforcement. For monitoring thematic areas such as risk identification, the following benchmarks can be used. Hazard maps, historical records of hazards and their impacts, vulnerability and capacity indicators developed and systematically mapped and recorded, percentage of development projects and investments with disaster risk assessment components, and more. Risk management indicators could include trends in deforestation, use of environmental impact assessments in disaster reduction planning, use of forestry management to reduce flood risk, extent of insurance coverage, use of safety nets and social protection in recovery processes, use of microfinance services in high-risk areas, enforcement of zoning plans, retrofitting, trends in the number of constructions in hazard-prone areas, and percentage of public buildings in compliance with building standards. Preparedness and emergency management can be monitored with the following indicators: emergency response networks and plans, tested and updated regularly, emergency funds and stocks, coverage and number of community training programs. As the disaster risk management concept is moving from centralized, government-led approach towards decentralized mode, there is also an emerging necessity to establish an indicator system to measure progress on community level. The latter will be discussed in Module 2. Through the process of knowledge creation and knowledge sharing, it is possible to engage civil society and market actors in disaster risk management, reduce vulnerability of communities at risk, and improve capabilities of the most affected to cope with consequences of hazardous events. There are 4 areas in knowledge management: information management and communication, education and training, public awareness, and research. In information management, the timely dissemination of information through appropriate channels and networks can be measured by the number of professionals and public networks, documentation and databases on disasters, forms and availability of end-user products, such as websites for public and specialized information and knowledge. Actions taken in the area of education and training include incorporation of disaster reduction into basic curricula of schools, vocational training, and dissemination of traditional knowledge. Community training programs can be monitored by referenced educational materials, number of courses, and institutions. Public awareness can be benchmarked against media coverage of disaster reduction-related activities, Disaster Reduction Day, and other visibility-raising activities. Research agenda in disaster management should include risk reduction, improvement in quality and availability of data, methodology-related development, and regional collaboration in research. Summarizing the previous slides, traditionally disaster management has focused nearly exclusively on actions that can be taken immediately prior to, during, or shortly after a disaster event to reduce the economic damage and loss of life. Funding recovery and reconstruction after catastrophic events has also often been seen as a sole responsibility of governments. In recent years, this traditional disaster management approach has been evolving slowly to include natural hazard risk management as a key element of the system, in addition to preparedness, response, and recovery planning and management. According to this new approach, risk management is an ongoing process and aims at reducing vulnerability to natural hazards across all levels of society and all economic sectors. To be effective, disaster risk management needs to become an integral part of economic planning and policy making. The role of different stakeholders, public, private sector, central and local government, communities and individuals, should be clearly defined in the system. Comprehensive strategy, commitment from the national government, and enabling environment for community initiatives are key to success. Text adapted from Catalin Demeter. Building Blocks of Comprehensive Disaster Risk Management, Concepts and Terminology. World Bank Institute, 2003.